Right, I think everyone has very rapidly joined us. I'm sorry to keep you in the waiting room for so long. It's always a moment to know when to press the button to allow everyone in. Very warm welcome to everybody to the first of our Hilary Term Lunchtime seminar series. These are seminars that we set up last term, very much coordinated by Professor Andrew Khan, who I'm deeply grateful for pulling together a fantastic set of speakers. And the point of these seminars is to really showcase the fantastic research that's going on in college by people on our fellowship. And far too often we hear lots of external speakers and we miss hearing about what actually people in college are up to, and today is no exception in terms of really broadening our knowledge, and certainly my knowledge base on a fascinating topic. So our first speaker is Dr. Alex Vukovich. Alex is actually in Toronto right now. She tells me on Ontario, and so it's 8 in the morning. So I'm deeply grateful for her getting up super early to talk to us today. Alex is a British Academy postdoctoral research fellow, and she's based in the Faculty of Medieval and Modern Languages, and she's also a junior research fellow in college in Byzantine and Slavonic history and literature. So Alex joined us in 2018, but before then she had an incredibly impressive academic career, as you would expect. She did an MPhil and then a PhD in Cambridge, and then held various fellowships, first of all in Cambridge at Newnham College, but then at the French School in Rome, and then the British School in Athens, and then at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, DC. So she's been all over the place, and some of the most beautiful cities in the world, I noted when I was looking at her CV. Alex's work, if you have a moment to look at some of her papers, I'd really recommend it. It's absolutely fascinating. And it's focused on the multicultural complexity of the Byzantine world. And today she's going to talk to us about one aspect of that work, which is looking at ritual and politics in Rus and early Muscovy. So Alex, if you could come online and share your screen, we very much look forward to hearing you talk. And then there's opportunity for questions at the end. Alex, over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Hello from Toronto. Hello from the morning. So I'm going to just quickly share my screen. So you should see.
Yeah, we can see it.
Yes, perfect. Okay, right. Well, in that case, I will begin. So thank you so much. Thank you for the lovely introduction, and thank you everyone for joining. I can see that we have quite a few people. I'm going to present today about my research, but I'll start first of all with the kind of, so I see that there are many people who may not really know what Rus or Muscovy are, what these words really refer to. And I'm going to start with the general introduction about, well, Rus and Muscovy before moving on to the kind of the meat of this topic, which is basically my research. So, ritual and politics in early Rus and early Muscovy. And what you see here in the background is a wonderful kind of introduction to this topic. This is it's a series of manuscript pages, of illustrated manuscript pages from the Illustrated Chronicle of Ivan IV, also known as Ivan the Terrible. And this is, I mean, I don't work specifically on this manuscript, but this is the genre of thing that I work on, which basically the texts of Rus and Muscovy. And this particular text is very unique because it contains approximately, I think, 20,000 of these illustrations, illustrating a history of Muscovy from early Rus and then kind of bridging the gap. So, but before we go into that, what is Rus? And so there are many ways of approaching Rus. In fact, Rus has many stories, and I think the best way to approach Rus, as my former thesis advisor Simon Franklin used to show this map, is to erase all of our kind of modern political boundaries. So to really explore this territory, which is northwestern Europe, the Eurasian steppe, kind of going into Central Asia, without any notion of the kind of modern state boundaries, because of course in this early period, we don't really have these, and especially for Rus, these don't apply. So Rus, one of the stories that we can tell about Rus is the story of long distance trade networks, or the kind of long distance history of the Viking world. So if you look at this kind of bright green area, areas subject to frequent Viking raids, forget about the little to no Scandinavian settlement. That's kind of meaningless here. This is an area that was very much, to some extent, part of the Viking diasporic world. The Vikings being kind of community of practice, sort of merchant, warrior group that gathered people along the way. And so one story that we can tell about the formation or the emergence of early Rus is this story of long distance networks of trade, and of course of settlement along these trade routes. So what were they trading? Well, initially we find large deposits of silver, largely silver dirhams, and this is an example of a 9th century silver dirham from the Samanid Emirate in Central Asia. So these coins are something that we find, for example, along this trade route, which goes straight up into Scandinavia. Approximately, well, over 1 million of these coins have been found in deposits in Scandinavia and across Rus. So this is a Viking hoard which was found. It's actually one of the largest Viking hoards ever found, with about 14,000 silver pieces, and it was found in Sweden. So this is the volume of silver. So this kind of high intensity trade is one of the stories that gives us kind of some of the first insights about what this territory was used for. It was used for circulation. It was its many river networks were used to circulate from the northern world across kind of what's now kind of continental, well, what's the European continent, but through Ukraine and through Russia down into either the Black Sea if going to Constantinople, which surprisingly was very much part of the Viking world in some ways, because it was an endpoint for trade, and beyond that through the Caspian Sea and the Sea of Azov into Central Asia, which is where many of these silver pieces were mined and minted. And so we're really looking at two types of trade. We're looking at, in the first map, this kind of long distance trade. And in fact, this map doesn't do the kind of distance justice, because we could go as far as China in this period under the Tang Dynasty to talk about how kind of far-reaching these trade networks were. For example, Chinese silk has been found as far as the British Isles in this period. Or we can look at local trade. We can look at trade, for example, within the territory of, well, local, this is really covering the European continent, but looking at kind of local trade between Scandinavia and new settlements in Western Russia, starting with the one that you see at the top, which is Lake Ladoga, where, for example, many artifacts of Scandinavian potentially manufacture, but also very close to kind of Scandinavian counterparts, have been excavated. So to some extent, we have this diasporic presence from a very early period, from the certainly from the 10th century onwards. And so it's no surprise then that from its inception, Rus kind of is a sort of melting pot, if I can use this this very modern term. the first kind of forms of the first self-representation that we get in Rus uses, for example, a Byzantine idiom. So, for example, the coins of the first Christian knyaz or prince of Kiev, Vladimir Sviatoslavich, they employ kind of Byzantine symbols and Byzantine religious and political forms. So here you have a piece, a much more sophisticated piece of gold, a gold solidus of Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus, and here we have a similar piece with many of the ceremonial and kind of ritual objects. We'll talk a bit more about that in a second, including the Byzantine stemma or diadem, the crown, and also, of course, the symbol of Christ. However, and sorry about that. The coinage of early Rus is quite varied, and it actually suggests that we don't really have one story, even in terms of the coins. Even where symbols are shared, we have a multiplicity of stories. So, for example, the coins of Kiev follow much more closely the coins of the Byzantine Empire, whereas, for example, this coin of Yaroslav Vladimirich, so the son of Vladimir, which was probably minted at Novgorod, according to new research, follows Byzantine seals. So it's still using, for example, Greek in its legend showing Saint George, but on the back we see something which I'll talk about in a second, which is the princely symbol, and the legend on the back of the coin is in Slavonic, and it reads Yaroslav, and this is his silver. However, in the southernmost point of Rus, we see a completely different kind of coin, which are these imitations, so pure imitations with a garbled legend, neither Slavonic nor Greek. I mean, it's illegible, of Miliarizia, so silver Byzantine coins. And this is something that I've just finished writing about. These coins suggest that even within this kind of territory, there are different dynamics. There are different interpretations of some of the kind of cultural inputs. So in this case, Byzantine, but also clearly mixed, as we can see, for example, with this princely symbol. So this is, I'm hesitant about calling it a tamga, but it resembles a tamga, which is a Central Asian kind of a Central Asian symbol that's found as far as, well, quite a lot of it is found in Sogdiana, which was an area or a kingdom, depending on the period, in modern Tajikistan. So clearly, one of the stories of Rus is also a strong, potentially a very strong steppe influence, and this is something that shouldn't be neglected. However, it's really with the rise of Christianity and the kind of Christianization of Rus that we begin to get a new kind of symbolic realm, including something that's going to become very important, and is very important for me, the rise of writing and written culture. And I just wanted to draw your attention to some of the monuments of Rus, including, well, the no longer existent, which it was destroyed in the 1930s, the monastery of St. Michael with the golden domes. However, the apse mosaic showing the Eucharist, it was saved, and it's currently in the Church of St. Sophia in Kiev. So this is a late 11th century mosaic, completely in Greek, which is not uncommon because St. Sophia, built in the early 11th century, also contains Greek inscriptions. So Greek is perhaps one of the first languages and first writing systems that we see in Rus. I don't want to say that it's the first system that's adopted, but it's the first kind of written culture that we see represented. This is the Church of Saint Sophia, Kiev, which I mentioned, with its fantastic apse mosaics, and also this kind of, it's a bit bizarre, representation of the hippodrome in Constantinople. So to some extent, after following the Christianization, the adoption of Eastern Christianity, there is a kind of expansion of representations that import Byzantine cultural forms, certainly religious forms, but also here the hippodrome, which is where horse racing took place. So horses and chariots, according to the Roman model, like for example in the Circus Maximus. However, very quickly there is a kind of particularism that develops certainly in the Northeast, in Vladimir Suzdal, with, for example, kind of new church shapes, as well as the advent of the sculpted icon. So this is the eastern facade of the Church of the Holy Virgin on the Nerl, depicting King David and his harp. And because what we're really going to talk about from now on is written culture. This is the Ostromir Gospel, which is the one of the oldest, not the oldest, manuscript from Rus. And so you can see that we're getting a kind of more sort of concrete Christian, but certainly Eastern Christian influence in this early period from the 11th century onwards. And so this is really where my presentation truly begins, because mostly this is what I work with. I work with texts, and I work with written culture. So the advent of written culture is a direct result of contacts with Byzantium and the South Slavonic world. So texts were, for the most part, translated from Greek into Old Slavonic, before that Old Church Slavonic. For example, certainly religious literature, the Gospels, hagiography, so the lives of saints, patristic literature, so the writings of the Church Fathers. So really anything kind of needed in order to establish religion and the faith was translated into Slavonic, and then kind of transferred to Rus. But beyond that, also Byzantine legal texts, such as the Nomocanon, as well as Byzantine chronicles, interestingly enough, which we have some in the South Slavonic world, but it's only in the north, in Rus, that these chronicles form the basis for locally produced literature, including hagiographies, we have sermons, but certainly, and this is what I'm interested in, chronicles written in analytic form. And just as a side note, if you're interested in kind of a comprehensive view of writing, there's a fantastic book by my former thesis advisor, Simon Franklin, Writing Society and Culture in Early Rus, which you can read on this topic, broadly speaking. So this is actually a translated Byzantine chronicle, translated in the South Slavonic world, in medieval Bulgaria, probably into Slavonic, and then copied in this case in Pskov, in what's now so in Rus. And here, for example, if you look at the image in the corner where there's a man who seems to be standing on a pizza, this is a Roman emperor, and this is a Roman ceremony, which is raising the emperor on the shield. It's a rite of succession, a rite of Roman succession. However, interestingly, here the interpretation of the investiture of King Solomon, the Old Testament king, is interpreted along Roman lines. So we can learn quite a bit even from these texts that are translated in terms of the language used, but also in this case, and this is a rare example, in terms of the illustration and the way in which this event is interpreted. So we can kind of gain insight into what they knew, for example, of, let's say, Byzantine or Roman culture. We can gain insight into how they interpreted certain things. Right. So now we get to the locally produced literature of early Rus, and this is something I'm extremely familiar with. This is the Laurentian manuscript, which is the earliest copy of a Rus chronicle from 1377. However, it refers to events in the very early medieval period. I mean, it begins with the start of the world because after that red bit, it starts with the Great Flood and Noah and the kind of division of the world. But it provides this kind of narrative in the form of annals. So in such and such a year, this happened, and then such and such a year, that happened. And it starts doing that really from a kind of very early period, from roughly the 8 and 900s. However, and I'll tell you about this a bit more. It it brings together all kinds of different elements to craft this narrative. So in this particular manuscript contains the primary chronicle and the chronicle of Vladimir Suzdal. The division of chronicles is somewhat arbitrary, but it's based around where narratives shift, because of course these texts, so of course this is a 14th century manuscript, however, it is a copy of something older. And in kind of copying these manuscripts over time, other elements get added. So for example, this manuscript contains the primary chronicle, and then it also contains a chronicle that tells us about the northeastern world, roughly up until the 15th century. And it's a short chronicle. So I just copied out the text here, and it basically, this is where we get the primary chronicle, or the tale of bygone years, as it's sometimes called, because this red portion reads, "These are the tales of the bygone years, about the origin of the Rus land, the first princes of Kiev, and from whence the land of Rus had its beginning." And what does it really tell us about? Well, for the most part, it gives us a genealogy. I mean, it establishes a kind of timeline. It establishes a biblical timeline, but it also establishes a timeline of largely the rulers of Rus. And we see kind of the world of Rus through them. So in the primary chronicle, some of these figures are legendary. Others are attested, for example, Princess Olga, she's attested to in Byzantine sources, and then from roughly the end of the reign of Vladimir, but certainly from the reign of Yaroslav and his successors, we have the beginning of this kind of annalistic form where we get, under such and such a date, so and so started ruling, and here's what happened from year to year. And this is how we kind of establish the proliferation of the dynasty, its proliferation over a territory that was almost constantly expanding until the Mongol conquest. And then the next one's just a scary slide, because I just wanted to show that, yes, this is expanding. So these are my genealogical tables that I made based on the chronicles. And it just gives us an idea of, well, who became prince of what, and new places kind of pop up in the various chronicles to give us indications of the territorial expansion of Rus. Right. So the chronicles themselves, these aren't all of them. There are quite a few. I don't really deal with the Siberian chronicles, but just wanted to show that there are quite a few chronicles. However, they tend to kind of interpolate or repeat basically what came before. So for example, the primary chronicle features heavily in the subsequent chronicles, because the chronicles try and establish linear time from, well, the beginning of time until the present, whatever that may be. And just to I use this slide for teaching just because there's a certain vocabulary when we talk about chronicles, and specifically the chronicles of Rus and Muscovy. When we talk about a manuscript, we're talking about the kind of physical entity, but a manuscript can be a compendium. It can be several different kinds of texts put together in order to form something cohesive or comprehensive in terms of the time it covers. We also have compilations, which means that the chronicles themselves contain different kinds of texts. For example, the primary chronicle, it also contains the lives of saints, contains panegyric. So we're looking at different kinds of texts. I won't get into recensions. The chronicles were copied. They were so copied by different scribes, which is why we have manuscripts that date from after a chronicle was written. These texts were edited, and new information was interpolated sometimes by scribes, and it's quite an adventure figuring out what was interpolated when, by whom, and then making assumptions sometimes about what the text looked like at the time when it may or may not have been written. So there is a whole area of study, textology, and linguistics dedicated to the chronicles. Okay, so the chronicles have been studied for a long time, roughly beginning in the 18th century. This is Gerhard Friedrich Müller, who was one of the first academicians, so members of the Imperial Russian, the Imperial Russian Academy of Sciences. And it's only really from the 19th century and certainly 20th century that the chronicles have been used for history, so historiographically, for the purposes of history writing. Certainly in medieval period, they have a function of, well, of recording what happened, unclear who read them or what they were used for. And in the 18th century, the initial kind of sort of purely, I would say, kind of stock use of these chronicles seems to have been to better understand the kind of provenance of the different people of what was then Russia, of what was then Imperial Russia, the Russian Empire, and this had to do with the fact that by that point Russia had expanded and had reached the Pacific Ocean, and so in the 18th century there were these kind of catalogs of the different peoples of Russia, kind of the beginnings of ethnography. Anyway, so when I work with these chronicles, I sometimes work with the manuscript, but more often than not, I work with, I'm sorry for this slide, I thought it was a better image, with this compendium of Russian chronicles. These are editions, and because chronicles exist in many manuscripts, the editions, they give all of the variants of the different manuscript readings, which is a very convenient way to read the texts. Most of the chronicles haven't been translated into English. I mean, some of them haven't even been translated into modern Russian. So to read them, one needs to know Old Slavonic or Old East Slavonic, and certainly for later chronicles, they're much closer to Russian as we have it today, but obviously not that close. Right. So my final bit is really about what am I doing with these chronicles, which is I'm looking at politics and ritual from Rus to Muscovy. So this is part of my British Academy project, and it's going to form it's going to result in a book, Politics and Ritual from Rus to early Muscovy, which expands to some extent expands what I was working on for my PhD, but my thesis and what I worked on subsequently really had a more kind of a taxonomy of rituals in early Rus. And I've written quite a few articles about kind of different types of rituals, for example, enthronement, rituals related to inauguration. However, what I'm interested in now is really looking at rituals and their constitutive significance. So instead of a constitution governing, for example, politics and how politics function, rituals serve as a form of structure. They structure political life, but they also constitute political life. And because we have only representations from these texts, sometimes sometimes it's very kind of piecemeal, the information that we get about how political life was constituted in early Rus and Muscovy. So I'm moving beyond the kind of purely symbolic realm of ritual as just externalization and representation. And I'm looking at, well, what these rituals are doing, how they transform, and what does that mean about how political life was constituted in early Rus and then in Muscovy, and I'll explain why there's this kind of dichotomy. So my research approach is really looking at this political development and transition, and for that I use obviously textual sources. I also use material culture, iconography, the built landscape. However, my approaches to these objects or texts are varied, and they include, for example, historical anthropology, hence the use of ritual as a kind of way in. And what I mean by ritual is a kind of a disputed term. There's no real consensus about what ritual is. Usually it's defined by tradition. So the liturgy is accepted to be a ritual or a ceremonial practice. Rituals can be very contingent. For example, my chronicles, it's very difficult for me to say this is exactly how a ritual was supposed to be performed, because the shaping of information about ritual is to make it seem more remote than it actually was. And I want to kind of get beyond this realm of are rituals something that's just completely banal, so it's by repetition that something becomes a ritual, and kind of move into the realm of looking at how rituals are constructed, and more importantly, why, and what needs to be in place in order for certain rituals to appear. So rituals, because often when we talk about ritual, we think about something that's repeated and that's very repetitive. Rituals can often be the exception. They can be something that's exceptional, that is made to look as if it was a repetition, but actually isn't. So for the political rituals of early Rus, we're not looking at, for example, court culture. We're looking at rituals in the absence of a court. And in this part of my work, I've explored, this part is really done, state making via custom and practice. And I don't want to list the various rituals, but they include enthronement, for example, rituals of commensality, dining, and this kind of thing, as well as rituals of peacemaking that kind of create relations between people. And beyond just kind of cataloging rituals, I look at rituals as an evolution of political life via the chronicles, looking at the cultural and kind of social influences, how rituals came about, how certain rituals came about, as well as the political economy, what conditions had to be in place materially in order for these kind of cultural forms to develop. And this is why there's a kind of separation between Rus and Muscovy in my work. It's because the 13th century onwards is dominated by the period known as, well, the period of Mongol suzerainty. The Mongols, over the course of the Middle Ages, conquered everything from China all the way to Croatia. This is a pretty dramatic rendering of the siege of Baghdad, and this type of thing was repeated across Rus and into Europe. So during the period of Mongol suzerainty, I look at the persistence of certain rituals, specifically whether or not there are certain rituals that kind of disappear, if they're superseded by something else. And I look at this as a kind of transitional period. What I'm also very interested in is what happens after the period of Mongol suzerainty. And for the period after Mongol suzerainty, I look at early Muscovite chronicles, mostly the Nikon Chronicle and the chronography. So for the political ritual of Muscovy, I'm very interested in kind of how these chronicles, how they reshape the past, how to some extent they suppress the Mongol influence and the period of Mongol suzerainty, and to some extent reimagine politics and kind of reinvent the state. With these Muscovite chronicles, there's actually a very there's an expansion of material that is interpolated into them, including Byzantine sources, as well as South Slavonic sources, Latin material. And some of this is the result of new kind of opportunities, of new possibilities opening up, certainly with the fall of Constantinople in 1453. There is, to some extent, a transfer of power, because I don't want to get into Moscow Third Rome or any of that. There is a transfer, for example, material, so of writing, of knowledge, that previously, so for example, old Byzantine material roughly from late antiquity onwards, that wasn't known, for example, in Bruce, but then becomes known in Muscovy. And these opportunities are mediated by a kind of expansion or kind of reconquest, if you will, of former Rus territory, which then quickly becomes mass expansion, which will culminate in the conquest and colonization of Siberia in the 17th century, and will push what's then the Russian Empire to the Pacific. And I'm not going to read all of this, but what I look at, for example, are things like this. For example, the 15th century inauguration of Dmitry Ivanovich, the grandson of Ivan III, which gives us, so this is just the beginning of the account. It's one of the longest accounts that we have, for example, for an inauguration, and it gives us, for example, all of the information about where everyone stood, what they did, but it also includes speeches. It also includes, for example, direct discourse in the form of, in this case, a sermon by the Metropolitan, who delivers this kind of sermon as a form of direct speech. And the sermon itself, interestingly enough, is an interpolation from a South Slavonic ritual, possibly a hymn for the installation of a bishop. I've actually been working on this text recently, and this is then at some point was brought to Muscovy and is interpolated into the chronicle, and then becomes part of, or is represented as being part of, the kind of ritual nexus. So it's made to look ancient. It's made to seem as if this is something that we've been doing all along, when in fact it is an innovation of the 15th century. It also interpolates some of Ignatius of Smolensk's journey to Constantinople, where he witnesses a Byzantine inauguration and wedding. So we're really looking at the adaptation and adoption of new forms, and it's a deliberate process. We're also looking at the invention of and kind of appearance of new objects. So I convened the Early Slavonic webinar, and this coming week we're going to have a researcher from Tatarstan who works on Tatar objects and Tatar material culture and its influence on she's looking at its influence on court culture in the Tsardom of Russia. So, for example, some of these objects, for example, the the cap of Monomakh is made to appear as if it's an ancient Byzantine ritual object, a crown given by the emperor Constantine Monomachos to a prince of Rus, who was supposedly his grandson. However, it is in reality something that is of later manufacture and very much resembles Tatar headgear and caps. So this is a kind of interesting kind of rhetorical invention of an object that has a different provenance than what its official kind of written provenance is supposed to be. I also look at the kind of creation of a new built landscape of new architectures. So this is the Palace of the Facets on the Kremlin, which was built roughly in the 15th century by Italian architects. So this kind of forming of a new built landscape also reflects these new influences and new opportunities, which occurred first of all as a result of the fall of Constantinople, hence the marriage between Zoe Sophia Paleologina and Ivan III. But also they show Muscovy's kind of good fortunes that they were able to bring these people over in order to build a kind of ceremonial landscape. And because, I mean, it no longer looks like this, but this is one of the oldest images of the interior of the throne hall of the faceted palace, the faceted chamber, and it shows. So we get some representations of ritual itself, starting roughly from this late period. Anyway, just to wrap up, so Muscovy is the culmination of what I work on, but it's the beginning of a process. It's the beginning of expansion under Ivan III, which is framed as a kind of recapture, but quickly becomes an expansion, which continues under his successors, certainly under Ivan IV or Ivan the Terrible. And this process of reconquest, it turns into expansion with the colonization of Siberia. And I just wanted to insist on this, that one of what's also kind of added in to my work is that I'm interested also in the role that the political economy plays in these ceremonies, in their elaboration, because this is the kind of basis that allows, for example, for the expansion of the built landscape, which to some extent reflects why certain kind of expanded rituals suddenly occur. It's just that there are, for example, more opportunities. There's more of a material basis to install the power of the early of the Grand Princes of Muscovy and certainly the early Tsars. So if I'm just going to leave it there, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. So thank you for listening.